Wow, what a train wreck. Cultures collide in Wings Over Yakyakistan, a two-part story arc spanning issues 55 and 56 of FiM. When Ember leads an attack on Yakyakistan for seemingly no reason, it's up to Spike to try and figure out her reasoning and how the conflict can be resolved. I was pretty interested when I read the synopsis for this arc, a feud between two nations with Spike in the middle. That sounded like an awesome idea, especially since Spike is a great character to tackle these kinds of stories and themes with, as we've seen in past episodes. So imagine my confusion when I start reading part 1 and I'm met with a story about Rainbow Dash's confidence issues. Despite there being an overarching story to tell, part 1 of this arc dedicates the majority of its time focusing on the wonderbolts of all characters and going into Dash's past about how she used to have stage fright. My first thought was, how the hell did this have anything to do with the story? How could it derail itself from its initial premise from the very first part? Then I thought that maybe I was jumping to conclusions, that maybe there was a point to the story going into this that I had yet to see. But nope, none of this ever plays into the rest of the story and it's never addressed again. We don't get into the actual meat of the story until part 2, and because of this, both parts feel like completely separate stories that happen to take place in the same area, rather than one continuous arc. I wish I could say that the problems end there, but they don't. Because the arc put itself at a disadvantage by wasting its first half on an unrelated distraction, part 2 not only has to pick up the slack and do what part 1 should have done, introduce the conflict, but it also had to resolve said conflict within the same breath. So what could have been an interesting, nuanced look at what's going on between the dragons and yaks is boiled down to a misunderstanding about an old scroll. And what makes this even worse is that this arc could have been a lot more than that. Throughout part 2, there were bits and pieces that could have made for a much better story if those were the focus. Part 2 had moments where several characters remarked that Spike doesn't act like a dragon. This has been brought up before, so it's nothing new, but the context in which it was used was what brought it to my attention. Twilight remarks that she momentarily forgot that Spike was a dragon because he acts more like a pony, and with the way that the lines are worded, it's clear that this is a metaphor for similar remarks like, "I sometimes forget that you're black because you act so white," or "I sometimes forget that you're a girl because you're just like one of the guys," as though being either of those things says something about how you're supposed to act. When Ember tells Spike about how the pony's assumptions about the dragons kept getting in the way of their integration, and how frustrated she was about her kind being stereotyped, I thought, why didn't the story focus on this? The struggle of having stereotypes imposed on you, leading to a cycle of succumbing to said stereotypes and further perpetuating them. And you can tell that these weren't accidental instances because they tried to address these themes in the conclusion, where Spike chastises the ponies for buying into stereotypes at the dragon's expense, and the dragons for succumbing to those stereotypes. But because the conflict was instead about a misunderstanding about a scroll, that speech loses almost all of the impact it could have had. This is the first arc Christina Rice has written that's tried to tackle such heavy subject matter, and it shows. The majority of her stories are rather lighthearted, and while it's great for a writer to try something new, the execution left a lot to be desired. Had the story maintained its focus, we could have had something on par with The Times They Are a Changeling with its themes of prejudice, but because they threw so many ingredients into the pot, Wings Over Yakyakistan ended up being a jumbled, disappointing mess that left me wondering what the thought process was when it was outlined. Next week, I'll be taking a look at issue number 57, a one-shot featuring Pinkie Pie and Discord, so maybe some silliness can help cleanse the palate. So what did you think of Wings Over Yakyakistan? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media, and consider supporting me through Patreon or PayPal art commissions. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.